Very well. So good afternoon and good morning for any West Coasters. Stephen Novosad here from Nordic, Canada. Really happy to have you on board for this lunch and learn. People are still pouring in, so this is going to be a popular one. Today, we have Carolyn Taylor, CSI Calgary biomechanist, also Nordic, Canada contract biomechanist. Carolyn was instrumental in our review of the biomechanics for the technique manual, and she will be presenting today the essence of biomechanics in cross-country skiing. And where we're going, we're hoping as a main message today to be able to pull out moving away from checklists and moving to greater understanding of movement, particularly as it pertains to our analysis of technique, understanding technique, and our interventions, interactions, looking at the principles as opposed to just ticking off a list as we work with athletes and promoting our sport. I would ask that everyone turn off their videos for the time being. Turn off your microphones as required for the moment. For questions, and I imagine there'll be some questions throughout, you can raise a hand. I will be monitoring all of the questions, or you can turn on your video. If I see your video come on, I will find an opportune moment to insert your questions that you can then turn on your microphone and ask. I think Carolyn is okay with that as well.
Yeah, by all means.
This will be recorded, as I've already mentioned, and available afterwards. While the current session is in English, we will also have a translated PowerPoint of the presentation, which will be available. We will make that information, we will share that information in the future. So good afternoon, Frida. I'm just asking everyone to turn off their vids during the presentation. If you have a question, you can turn it on. With that, I will also be monitoring the chat. If anybody has any questions that they prefer asking through chat, I will also be able to transmit those. If that is all good, I don't want to take up any more of Carolyn's time because that's what everyone is here for, not to hear me ad lib. Carolyn, I will leave it up to you. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today. Just so you know, I'm going to be turning my video off. So when I share the screen, you'll be able to see the PowerPoint and some of the videos. So, you know, not that I don't have faith in my Lenovo ThinkPad, but you just never know with technology these days. So I will share my screen. Give that a second. There we go. So, principles of biomechanics, we're going to call this part one because obviously there's lots of biomechanical principles. That's why I had to go to school for as long as I did. But we're going to try and focus strictly on the ones that are most valuable to cross-country skiing and seem the most obvious to make sure that, you know, we really nail down and everyone has a very clear understanding of what they are and how to apply them. So these are our three objectives I just laid out, and hopefully we meet all three of those at the end of this. If not, please hold me accountable and make me backtrack if there is something that I'm not explaining very well. So yeah, as you can see on the board, so the principles of biomechanics, I like to joke with all the physiologists and stuff because I always tell them they're just taking a best educated guess as to what's happening. But when it comes to physics and biomechanics, there is laws, as I like to say, and it's math. So we kind of got to go. Like there's only one way to accelerate, really. It's so let's make sure that we get that across. So I want everyone to understand, I will, sometimes people get, I will throw up some variables and stuff on the board and equations, and it's not to intimidate. You don't have to be good at math in order to understand the gist of the session. I find it easier when people see variables to actually see how you can manipulate it in order to get the end result that you want. So I will walk through a couple of those that I pull up. And most importantly, it's how do we take these principles and actually apply them? Every athlete is going to be different. The principles are always going to be the same, but at the end of the day, we want to increase the speed or the velocity that our athletes can move with. And based on their strengths and weaknesses, we can determine which principles we can really capitalize on and try and maximize their strengths. Well, we send them to the gym to work on the weaknesses. And again, to me, when we analyze technique and we apply these principles, you need to understand your athlete. We need to understand the strengths and the weaknesses. And we need to know that the weaknesses we're going to continue to work on in other ways, but we find a technique that works now and evolve that technique as our athlete's strengths improve and change as well. And then, there we go. Yeah, determine how to apply it to each individual athlete. So the ones that we decided that we'll cover today are principles of stability, the principle of impulse. Hopefully none of this sounds like a different language quite yet. Principle of producing maximal force, and we can discuss whether or not we do want to produce maximal force and at what points throughout the technique we may or may not want to, and what points throughout the race we may or may not want to. And also the principle of force application. So that's basically the meat of the principles as they apply to cross-country skiing. The potatoes and honorable mention are, principle of streamlining. We talk a little bit about momentum, but we're not going to delve too deep into it. Friction. Hopefully everyone's got a wax technician that understands friction. And then angular, kinetics, and kinematics, we're just going to set aside and perhaps talk on another day. So the fundamentals of any sport technique is this principle of stability. And this I'm going to weigh on a little bit here because it's so important. Understanding the center of mass, line of gravity is essential to any technique that we analyze, whether it's cross-country skiing or any other sport. So maximum stability requires a low center of mass and hence low, but we can also talk about whether or not we always want a low center of mass or how does that change if we're sitting a little higher, especially those that work with sit skiers. Where that center of mass is critically important, not only for your technique down straights, but how are we turning and how are things, what differences in body position can we manipulate in order to manipulate where our center of mass is height-wise. Base of support, again, this is something that is constantly changing in cross-country skiing. And ultimately, where that center of mass is within our base of support. So remember, there is another variable that affects the principle of stability, and that's that greater mass increases stability, but just within the context of cross-country skiing in most sports, with the exception of like the judos and some of the martial arts where you want to take on some of your opponent's weight to help make you stable. It's not something that is applicable to cross-country skiing, but just be conscious that it is another factor. And understand that cross-country skiing is a constant cycle of stability and instability back to stability, and we repeat this over and over again. There are times where we want to be unstable, but unstable in a controlled manner as well. Base of support and center of mass. So just if you look at the pictures below, I don't know at what point what is actually touching the snow or where their weight is, but understand that base of support is basically anything that is in contact with the ground. So this is just an overhead view. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not, but the next picture to the right, I am assuming that the person has most of their weight on the ski here and that this ski hasn't touched the ground, in which case the base of support is made up of the entire ski and also where that pole plant is. Now, in this position, based on what we know about center of gravity, base of support, and stability, the athlete's center of mass is not within that base of support. But this is common, especially in skate skiing. This is actually desirable. Whereas if we have two skis on the ground and two poles on the ground, you can see how the base of support changes. And then again, assuming that the other ski is on the ground and the two poles have been removed from the snow, that's how your base of support has changed. Sorry, did I hear something? No? Okay. Okay, so understanding center of mass, it's usually located around the belly button. But you got to understand that center of mass is going to change with body composition as well, but also in terms of your joints are moving through a range of motion. So you are actually moving the mass in different directions. So as our arms come forward, the weight of our arms coming forward is actually moving our center of mass forward. And again, when we are extending our trunk, we're lifting up our entire upper body. So our center of mass is going to be moving back. So it's interesting when I see manuals, when they talk about where your pole plant and everything should be. Pole plant has no reference to where your feet are. The most important thing analyzing technique is where that center of mass is, because where we're applying force, where our center of gravity is helping determine the direction that force is going. And we know that if we want to move forward, then we should be applying the force directly backwards. So again, as the athlete is moving all the arms forward and the head is moving forward, center of mass is moving forward. So it's probably slightly in front of our hips at this point. So when we talk about where the pole plant is, there can be debate. Technically speaking, if you are applying poles or applying any force that is in front of your center of mass, then it's technically acting as a breaking point for you. The argument being is when someone does apply their poles in front of their center of mass, are we actually putting the full weight of the poles down on the ground, or does that not happen? Does it take a fraction of a second for us to engage our hands and push those poles into the ground forcefully, whereas you can tell center of mass is already moved forward, one, because the athlete has moved her trunk forward a bit more, two, because the poles have come back slightly because they're moving as the ground moves. And obviously, the faster we're moving, the faster those poles are going to come behind us. So force application there is important to note. So again, the athlete is moving forward. Center of mass is probably now more probably in the middle of the foot at this point. And obviously, as the poles come up. Now, as the athlete is getting up, yes, if someone were to push me by the side because she is higher up and has raised her center of mass, yes, she'd probably get nudged and likely topple over a bit more. So when you're skiing on the turns and stuff, there is a purpose of wanting to be a little bit lower, simply because if you do get knocked at the side, you are increasing your chances of being knocked over. So again, and starting to get into positions I quite like and are desirable. Here, if our center of mass, yes, it is down on the ground. We don't have a pole plant here. I'd probably argue that her skis are probably unweighted to this point and her center of mass is forward. So she's actually more in an unstable position only because she doesn't have a firm hold on the ground at any point here. But it is the falling of the center of mass, because gravity is going to take that center of mass and pull you straight down. And it is that coming down, which she is actually using to her advantage, applying directly into the snow and able to get a propulsive force out of it. Other things in terms of the sit skiers. Okay, so center of mass can be different when you're looking at equipment for sit skiers. So here we have a sit skier sits relatively high. That's a choice for him. Remember, if he were to sit lower, chances are he'd have to decrease his pole length. So essentially that could affect the length of his stroke or his, well, yeah, essentially the distance he would cover with each pull. But the disadvantage to sitting higher, again, is when you're going around the turns, being higher up is going to give you a greater risk of falling over.
So Carolyn, we have a question.
Yep.
That I will just iterate. And just about the force application, the moment of force application, relative to the center of mass and where that needs to be to optimize the forward movement.
Yes, to optimize the forward movement. So again, if we are applying any force, and I'm going to skip out of this and just move over to another video that I had, which will also show it. Okay, I'll pull this up for a second here. And this is also something I have probably a question for the coaches as well at the end when we discuss this more. So if I look at the athlete on the right-hand side here in the blue, all right, center of mass is probably somewhere just in front of the belly button here. And I say that because we have a big leg that's coming in behind our hips, but we also have our upper body leaning forward. We have the mass of our arms. We have the mass of the one leg that's coming forward. So if, and this is something I see quite a bit in skiing, is we like to open up this leg for some reason when we're about to come down on it. If we are applying force here and trying to pull back on our leg and our center of mass is still behind that foot, then for that brief moment until our center of mass is over top of that force application, then we're actually technically slowing ourselves down. Now, the question is, yes, that's the principle, but there's always a play with how you determine technique for your athlete. And I worked with the sprint hurdles team for years, and we had at one point 5 hurdlers that were in the top 12 of the world. So we were kind of blessed. I don't know what was in the water in Pickering, Ontario, but that's where quite a few of them were from. And when it came to their technique and where they planted the foot when they came down from the hurdle, all depended on the information that I got from the physiologist. So when we do testing in terms of reactive athlete versus a athlete that great power, but it just takes their body that fraction of a second longer to actually engage, that made things a little different. So with that athlete who was a little slower to generate the power, I actually wanted her foot planting a little forward in front of her mass. Yes, it was a little bit slowing her down, but the payoff pitch was by the time the foot got to the optimal position under her center of gravity, then the power in the leg was ready to go and it was optimized in a position that gave us the greatest forward velocity or forward acceleration leading to the greatest velocity. So here, I would kind of argue it's a little too far in front. But again, I don't know the physiology of the person. And we know that when collapsing on that foot, we get a little bit of a stretch reflex. So ideally, when we are the force application, if it's in front of the center of gravity and we want to move forward, that's going to work against us. But again, there is a play. Yes, that's the mechanics, but the biomechanics is how is our body working and what is the give and take? This is where there is an art to coaching. So you need to understand your athlete in terms of understanding where we're applying force, where we're planting our foot, and where we're planting the pulls. But the general principle overall is if we want to move forward and we're applying force that's in front of our center of gravity, it is going to slow us down. So
just building on that again,
yep.
We have the question that you've mentioned that if the polar leg is ahead of center mass, then you're slowing yourself down. Can you explain why? And I'm assuming this has to do with vectors, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah. Again, so let's see if what's the proper drawing tool here. So maybe that would be the center of gravity here. So if we are trying to pull back, and we'll say that the weight is probably on the heel. Of course, it goes the wrong way. All right, so we're trying to pull back here, but essentially because our line of gravity is here, and it goes straight down from where your center of gravity is, all of this is slowing until we get back. So this is actually acting in the opposite direction. I'm not going to try and fumble anymore with this as it is. But think about if the ski pole was straight up and down here. All right, so this is getting a little close and our angle is obscured, but figure that that is straight up and down. For you to pull yourself from that direction, you cannot do that fast whatsoever. Okay, so just think about something in front of you, and until you can guarantee that that pole, until it starts coming back, you are not applying any force. Let me get rid of all of this. So I'll draw this one on the pole. So this is a much better pole angle. All right, so if this is the pole coming in a backwards direction like this, it's going to be split. There is a vertical component, and then there is a horizontal component. All right, the vertical component, so when we're planting our ski pole in this direction, part of that force that we are applying is going straight down, and part of it is pulling back towards us. However, until that passes this point, there's no way we can do that fast enough or move our center of gravity forward until that happens. Now, we have momentum and everything else working in our direction, and chances are we're only in this compromised position for a split second. But anytime you're looking to have the most efficient technique, right here, now all of a sudden that's underneath our center of mass. And now all of our force being applied is going directly back, although you got to remember there will always be a vertical and a horizontal position. So ideally, if I just wanted to pull back, then I'm really low to the ground and my ski poles are as low as possible, and I'm just heaving it as much horizontally as I can. Anytime this vertical, you can't get past the vertical, because remember, if we were to recover our ski poles, we need to, if we were too low down, then we wouldn't be able to bring our trunk up all the way and everything else. So it's always going to be an interaction of where you plant versus the range of motion in your trunk and upper body. And knowing your athlete. Does my athlete, are we fast twitch? Are we quick? Like, do I have the ability, because I don't have a very heavy upper body by any means? Because remember, our athletes are quite different in terms of our upper body mass and lower body mass. Some of us are really big and bulky on the upper part, and some of us are a little bit more slight. So those that are a bit more slight will be able to move that upper body up and down and recover it much quicker than someone with the bulkier upper body. So how much we want to get low and really capitalize on that pull on the pole depends, again, how we are built and how quickly we can recover our body to get back into that position again, because the time we spent in recovery is time that we're not applying any force to the ground. I don't know if that answered the question or not. I feel I'm getting leagues ahead of us of where we're trying to go here.
We'll keep you up as they keep coming in for clarification.
So maximum force. So again, this is another principle of biomechanics. So maximum force requires the use of all joints that can be used from larger to smaller. Now, when we think about that, there's a couple of questions that we have. For one, do we always want maximal force? So are we always using our entire upper body? Are we always extending our hips or our knees, our ankles, our toes? What are we doing? And do we want that every time? Again, remember that this is for maximal force, but we may or may not want that. Depends where we are in the race. What kind of range of motion do we want? So again, remember, we talked about larger to smaller and use of all the joints. Well, sometimes the more joints you use, the more you really need to make sure the timing of every single one of those joints is bang on. Otherwise, we are not translating the force we generate with one and translating it to the next joint, and thereby building the summation of forces to get a maximal force. Sometimes we want it, sometimes we don't. Range of motion, what kind of range of motion are we looking for? So if we're going uphill, do we want a maximal range of motion? If we know that if these athletes, we're going uphill, and if we know these athletes are going to fully extend their trunk, then center of mass is going to be going all the way back as well. And now for our pole plant needs to be either underneath our center of mass or behind it if we want to move forward. And this, if you planted your pole too far in front of your body and too far in front of your center of mass, essentially, well, that's going to be pretty tough to pull yourself up. I think this eventually gets to an uphill part. Not from a side view. Let's go with, there we go. So I think everyone intuitively knows as a coach that if our skier is not leaning forward on an uphill and we don't have the bend in the knees and we're planting that foot too far in front of us, then we're never going to get our center of mass up and over top. And we'd essentially end up going backwards, which is maybe what I kind of do. But we'll see if we get a better angle as we come in. So again, when we look through this, you'll also see such a variety in technique as well. Notice how close the athlete's knees are to each other here. Again, think about what direction you are trying to apply that force. Think about what movements are not working in that forward, backward direction and applying that force in the direction you want. Okay, we definitely, again, it's tough to get the right angle on many of these. Going back to that side view at the very beginning here. All right, if this foot being planted here is too far in front of us, again, we're slowing down and she won't be in a good position to pull with the hamstrings. And again, when our center of mass gets over top of that foot, now we're starting to push with the quads. Same thing, if we planted too far in front, we would have briefly slowed down our center of mass. So when you're going uphill, there is no option. Don't put it in front of you or you're going to be struggling and fighting to get back over top of your legs and to be able to push. If not, if we start pushing when our mass is on top of our legs, we're going to be pushing ourselves up and not forward. Okay, so if I continue this here, we can see the direction that our foot is. All right, our center of mass, it all goes through the center of mass. So when I'm applying force application to the snow, that force application is going through the center of mass. And based on those angles and the position, again, there is going to be a vertical and there is going to be a horizontal component to all of this. All right, we want to maximize that horizontal component because that's what's driving us forward. You do need, because you need to increase friction with the snow, there's always going to be a downward force or impulse that is applied. But if it were in front of us, then essentially if we're pushing and our foot's in front of us, we are pushing ourselves backwards. Okay, if we were to put our foot here, then all of a sudden our center of mass is here and now we're applying a small force backwards. So we have to know where our center of mass is at all times. Otherwise, we end up with less desirable motion and very inefficient technique. So, do we always want maximal force? When would be an example of not having maximal force? Sorry, I'm just reading some of the comments here. Range of motion. Do we always want maximal range of motion? So we went with the sit skier here. Okay, obviously this athlete isn't top caliber, shall we say, although I would argue much higher caliber than myself. When we're talking about range of motion, a lot of the time there's debate in terms of how far in front of the body the hands should be. Okay, how far outside should we actually be skiing? We can see here that we are pushing and our skis are angled. So we're pushing out to the side and forward. Most efficient is the more narrow this can be, the better. However, it's always a balance in terms of how much to the side you need in order to get properly on that edge. Not a lot of us can rotate our hip in a direction that allows us to pull straight backwards and then still recover the ski quick enough underneath ourselves. But range of motion, so how far in front of the shoulders, for example, should the arms be? And then the other question when you're looking at the shoulders is, how far out to the side should the poles be? And again, when we look at follow through and we look at the follow through from here, for example, here's the ski pole. I want it to be coming directly backwards at all times if possible, because that means we're moving forward. But anytime it is out to the side, it means I'm also pushing in towards the middle as well. And there is going to be that component that is pushing me to the side. So part of me wants to push to the side, and I want to push to the side in this case because I do want to move my center of mass over to the left so I can properly load that left leg. So here, I'd argue center of mass is not over that leg. So really, we don't have a very efficient push. We're not properly loading that leg. So that doesn't work. Now, in terms of, I had some uphills. Where's my downhill? Now that I've moved all my clips around.
Well, Carolyn will maybe take an opportunity as you're searching for that to multitask because Lev has a question here about any cues for optimizing that how far the center of mass needs to be.
Optimizing how far the center of mass needs to be in relation to what?
In relation to the skis. So the question was, where is the center of mass in terms of your position uphill? Center of mass further forward permits more backward force onto snow, so more propulsion, but there's trade-off, biomechanics, arm-leg force ratio, etc. But just where's that balance and the sense of developing that feel as well?
Of developing that feel. It was interesting working with some of the athletes at the Nordic Center. And it was just, there are some athletes that you can explain the whole center of mass, direction of force, and they understand the concept and then they go and play with it. They're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Oh, yes, now I can tell the difference. An athlete will be able to feel when they're more effective on a pushing with the pole and just having them play of where they plant it. But you need to make sure when an athlete is working and playing around of where they're planting the pole, that the rest of their upper body, the rest of their position is still the same. Because if not, now they're changing the center of mass position and they're changing their pole plant. So they may not be able to tell the difference. So if an athlete is keeping the same trunk angle, well, double poling, let's take, for example, going up a hill, have them first change where their trunk angle is and see where their normal poling is, and then just change where the poles are planting. And then the next step is you can change their trunk angle once again and have them play around. You will be able to feel when you are really pushing yourself back, because if I could take a pole and purposely put it at an angle, so keep my trunk position the same, but just angle it and just manipulate it within my wrist so that the pole is actually coming behind me more. I'll get a video here to... All right. So if we took this athlete, they'll notice the difference between planting their pole there and planting their pole here. You will know that you can feel that you are going forward if your ski pole is further behind you. It doesn't always make sense to do that because now I am limiting the range of motion that I can push with. So maybe my pole goes from there to eventually here. And really, I've only pulled with the pole this distance. Okay. Whereas I want to maximize it and put it just at the very front or wherever I'm starting to put the force into it. So if I'm just going and planting my pole and I'm just sitting it down here, but I'm not really applying any weight or anything to it, then it's not affecting my motion at all. As long as you're just letting it go with the snow and you're not putting any force into it, so there's no downward force on it, then it's not really going to affect you, and it's so negligible, you're not going to feel anything. But the advantage and what we want to do is maximize the range of motion still. So if I'm doing that, I want to make sure that this ski is being planted, and I actually like the position here because center of mass is probably right here. All right, I'm going to say that that's fully aligned. And eventually, you know, we're going to be back here when we finish. So I want to maximize this distance that my pole can go and travel, and I can apply effective force on it. If I am planting it here, slightly in front, that first little portion here is acting against me. And again, I am assuming that you are applying force when you put the pole there. So that little fraction there is going to slow you down, but then you're going to capitalize and have a long pole the rest of the way. The key is trying to eliminate that small little fraction of inefficient technique and just plant it perfectly where it is. Again, if they are applying force right away. Again, if your athlete is going to take a little bit of time to generate the force because they're not as fast twitch as the other person, now you get to play and manipulate that a little bit because they actually need to feel it in to activate the shoulders and the posterior back muscles in order to get their body optimized to get the forceful and the powerful pull coming from it. But if the athlete is one that as soon as that pole touches the ground, like they're already applying, then you need to make sure it's further back and it is not in front of their center of gravity at all. That is where you can start taking off, you know, every, you know, 100th of a second each time you plant your pole. So it's always close. An athlete will be able to feel it. You will be able to feel it.
So thanks, Carolyn. In interest of time, I'm just looking at time. We'll move ahead. Lev had asked the question, a condensed question, was the physics in determining the optimum center of mass position? I think this is a big continuing conversation, and I invite emails with these questions if we can't address them today, and we can definitely build on that as we move forward. So thanks.
Sorry, guys, this is the first time I've done a presentation over Zoom. I prefer to see everyone. Okay, maximum force, range of motion, examples, key examples. Okay, larger to smaller. Does it always make sense to go largest to smallest? So Newton's second law of motion. So forces produced by muscles cause a segment to move faster and accelerate, and it's a summation of force that I talked about earlier. And larger joints are usually slower. So usually we think about activating our quads, going all the way down to the toes. But interest of time, instead of asking everyone, where are examples where we don't want to? So not as much trunk movement. Yes, we know that the trunk movement can be essential in applying some downward force, but chances are our weight enough is good enough for the wax pocket on our skis to give us the friction that we need. So let's not worry about that. But we got to remember it's also a very cyclical movement. So it's not a single maximal force effort like a high jump or a long jump or anything else. So we also need to keep in mind that in terms of the range of motion, there is no point having a big long pull or big long push or leg kick if we cannot recover that leg in a quick enough time in order to get it on the snow and apply force again. So the range of motion that you have of each of those joints is also going to be very different. And do we always need massive shoulder range of motion in the shoulders? We're not always trying to push back as much as possible. And we know that if the further our arms move behind us, then we're shifting our center of mass behind us as well, or it's moving backwards. And again, as discussed on the uphills, we don't want it all the way back there. We need to keep our center of mass forward, keep our feet underneath, and really adjust how long of a push we have with the poles and the legs in order to get up that hill without falling backwards. So we've kind of jumped a bit of that there. Direction of force application. Again, we're slowly covering this all at the same time. So force must be applied in the direction of the desired motion. So in classic ski, it's quite obvious and we can see the direction. We know we want to go forward. We've got some tracks to help us keep us in that direction. But the arms, I find, is always one that not always there. So we can talk about this one I had just pulled up, for example, of where we're planting that pole. Again, we discussed that in a skate ski, it does need to have some sort of application that's moving our center of mass or helping us move our center of mass so we can properly get loaded on there. We can also see that this athlete, for example, also rotated the trunk to get the weight onto the left ski and coming forward. And we can talk about, well, I could talk about this till I'm blue in the face and analyze this. This is an example though. She's trying to move forward. She's got her weight on her right leg. Yes, this is her finishing stroke. I only use this because it was an example of something you would see earlier in the race as well. It's just an example of where her pole plant, the direction she wanted to go, her pole being out to the left-hand side like that, was not in favor of the direction she wanted to push. And she's really having to move her upper body over in order to counter that movement. So same thing, the front view, when I'm looking at the direction of the poles and the application, I'm always looking in terms of where are the hands planted in relation to where the ski poles are actually being planted. So this athlete here, you can see that this arm is out to the side, but almost directly up and down on that ski pole. And this one is coming, you notice her hands are inside, which is giving this direction to where her ski pole is planted. So it wasn't the plant itself, it was where her hands were actually planted. And this you can see because it's not left and right. Now we're going to be pushing slightly to her right. So it can be very picky at times. Another thing is to watch where the follow through is coming. You notice there's definitely something wonky with this. So she had ended up pushing slightly out to the side, and you can see that even in the recovery phase, her ski poles are outside of her shoulders. That was a much better plant. And you can see different positions and different plants as they come through here. Again, position of the hands. What are the angles of the poles? Those ideally from the front view should all be straight up and down. All right. I'm just gonna delete this. So examples of skiing when we're actually not applying the force in the direction that we want, that's when we start seeing the bobbing motion. So typically, if we were all in a classroom session together, I'd ask you guys to explain that, but interest of time, we'll just go through it. Bobbing motion, it means we're starting to, I don't know if you guys want to call it the push with the legs or the leg kick. We are starting to apply force when it's too far underneath us or slightly in front of us that we end up pushing. And again, that vertical component is too much still. And we're pushing our center of mass up when ideally center of mass is just going to stay on the straightest plane possible and just move horizontal. That's not going to happen all the time, but bobbing motion is an example. Ski slapping is an example. And then as I just walked through, the follow through with the pulls out to the side is an example. Okay, principles of impulse. And again, this is where I want to be careful not to scare anyone off. But it is important to understand the variables within each principle and to understand what affects what. So impulse. So it's all about applying the greatest impulse possible if, again, within the context of maximum force application. So the greater the applied impulse, the greater the increase in momentum. And the increase in momentum, essentially, if you look at momentum, is mass times velocity. Our mass isn't changing. It's the exact same thing. Okay, so it's just changing our velocity from a slower velocity, hopefully to a higher velocity. So there are three ways in which we can do this. One is increasing force applied. So you can see, and again, get rid of the mass because mass is going to be the same. We are not increasing or decreasing, or of course, if a physiologist was there, yes, we are losing some water weight. All right, but let's just ignore them for now. So essentially mass stays the same. So it's just, if we want to increase our velocity, we either have to increase our force or we have to increase the time of which force is applied, or we can increase both. Will both lead to a greater velocity. Now, the problem with that is, yes, that makes sense to a certain extent, and yes, that's the principle, and those are the mechanics, but it's not the biomechanics. We know that the human body doesn't react that way. Okay, and the biggest issue here, it's not that increasing force, it's that increasing the time on the ground that it takes to apply that force. It does not make sense for us. We want force to actually be applied over the shortest time possible. All right, that is getting more towards power. All right, because that's what we want to accelerate ourselves. We also know from the biology of the way our muscles react that we want to produce a large impulse and greater increase in speed, but we want to do it over a shorter period of time. And everyone knows that is a stretch reflex. Okay, so when we are moving our muscles through a different range of motion and we are stretching those muscles, we want to essentially apply the force right away and very quickly so that stretch muscle can actually contract quickly. And again, the other thing to consider from a biology point of view is when we go back to range of motion, if I asked a 12-year-old figure skater and I said, look, you're going to be able to jump higher if you move through the largest range of motion in that knee joint as possible, because moving through a larger range of motion means we are applying that force over that greater period of time. Well, we know if I took a 12-year-old figure skater and said, okay, get into 90-degree knee bend and jump as high as you can on one leg, that's not going to be possible. For one, the way that the muscle contracts, we want to find their peak range. So everybody is slightly different on this, and this is something that we can test. But I don't want cross-country skiers to move fast with 90-degree range of motion, because what we find is the last 20, 30 degrees is where our muscle is aligned properly. We talk about all the muscle spindles, cross fibers. It's just the nature of how muscle reacts, period. It likes to be slightly stretched, but not overly stretched. And we also can't be fast when it's too tight and not enough range of motion. So our muscles like to be stretched slightly. So that, again, yes, we could apply a greater impulse if we applied force over a greater period of time, but that doesn't make sense based on our biology and how our bodies work. It also doesn't make sense that the longer we're on a pull, we eventually need to recover everything and bring it back. And again, when we're recovering, we're not applying force. So therefore, the only thing coaches should be worried about is increasing the amount of force application, period, and doing it quickly. So range of motion, again, I've always talked about a bit. The range of motion is going to be dependent on several different factors. The speed that the skier is going. So how far in front do I need to get my hands and everything? Because one, I want to have a great range of motion. But two, if I'm going really slowly, then I'm going to need short and quick rather than super long. Flexibility of the skier, like there are shoulder flexibility issues, but also some skiers, like you also, I don't know if you guys have talked about it with physiologists or not, but you can actually also overstretch your muscles that they're not optimally conditioned in order to apply force either. Strength of the skier is always going to be a dependent factor. Again, how far out are you better bringing your hands forward in front of you and just angling your pole a little differently in order to apply that? Or if you're not strong enough, do we need to bend the elbow a little so the hand's a little bit closer to our body? Again, you can't ignore the angle of the pole. It still needs to be planted optimal to our center of gravity. But how far out in the range of motion we have in our shoulders will depend largely on the strength of the skier as well. And then terrain and other external forces, like you guys know that you'll only be able to push so far out on slushy snow before you start slipping. So that, or even, are you going uphill? Are you going downhill? What's happening? That will determine the range of motion you use each time as well.
So general question, a practical question here as well, Carolyn, and in your opinion, which is the most overlooked joint that needs addressing coaching skiers as general patterns among skiers that show a poor use? I'll let you take a crack at that, but of course, I think that's highly dependent on style and clubs as it's developed, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, with sports that I've worked with over the years, I can usually tell you which club each athlete is from based on their technique that they use. Honestly, I don't think it's one joint over the other. I think sometimes we don't appreciate how different everybody is. Like, you think about a cross-country skier, you have some athletes that are a 50% upper body and 50% lower body, and some are stronger on the upper body and some are stronger on the lower body. So all those joints and angles and ranges of motion are all going to change. But I find a lot of the time we have this idea in our head of what the optimal technique is. And, you know, we want everyone to look like the, you know, top Norwegian skier, for example, or, you know, we want everyone to look like our Brian McKeever, whatever it may be, but not realizing how different we're just built, not just proportionally, but also on where strengths are. Some people tell me that, oh, pulling is overrated. I'm like, well, don't tell me pulling's overrated. Look at the size of the shoulders and back and triceps on that athlete. Like, that's an athlete until we develop the lower body. I want them to maximize that upper body contribution. So for me, it's not any one joint. It's just looking at the individual athletes and having a true appreciation for their strengths and weaknesses and where they need to go. And it's good to know based on their body shape in terms of, are you all legs or are you that 50-50 proportion? And knowing that there is an ideal technique for how that shape of the athlete's going to be, but also understanding that that ideal technique, we're not strong enough, we don't have enough core strength or whatever it may be. The cheat answer is always saying core. everyone will always say, well, we're not engaging our core, or we don't always look at it because we get stuck looking at the extremities. We don't always look at the core, but I guess aside from everything else, you need to understand where the pelvis is, because that's where we tend to lose a lot of force. If I go back to the PowerPoint, we have impulse and force absorption. And let me just skip ahead here. Impulse and force absorption. So we don't always want force absorption. There are times that we want to, but what ends up happening is we end up applying force. And essentially, when I see our bum kick out from underneath us, or a curvature in the back starting to occur, to me, that's us applying force to the ground, not stabilizing it in the core, so it never actually gets fully translated to moving our center of mass forward, because we've spent all this time and energy applying the force, but it went in the wrong direction, and then we started absorbing it with everything, right? There's an example of when we're going on downhills and we want to keep our center of mass at a steady height. We don't want it going up and down. So what do we do with our knees as we're going over the hills? We're actually absorbing the force over a greater range of motion in order to not move our mass up and down and start bobbing up and down. We don't want to be thrown upwards by the snow, so we will just let our legs absorb, and we do that by bending our knees and bending our hips and just taking it as it comes, but then pushing at the right time. Were there other questions there, Stephen?
There is one, and just also noting that time, just respecting people's time. We had a huge attendance and grateful for that, and hopefully everybody's benefiting as much as I am. The question was, for average builds, is there a general force ratio for upper versus lower body? I think
that one I would have
alluded to that, but I would just say we are going to come back. We've committed to more biomechanics talks. Hopefully that's not a surprise for you, Carolyn. So we're going to collect a lot of these questions, and we can come back to these at another time, because we will have to be wrapping up today.
Yeah, it's funny, when we go through biomechanics, one of my favorite things to do is just look at technique and see what we all see as picking out the little nuances and just talking about, yes, there's certain body positions, but do we understand why? And can we relate it back to, again, the strengths and athlete weaknesses, again, or strengths, and just going from there and just spitballing. So we've skipped over some of these aspects, and again, it's all encompassing, and there's a lot to be said and delved into, and this is just scratching the surface of it. As you can see, as soon as I start pulling up video, you can just go on, and what about this, and what about this, and that's always going to be the case. I think what's really important, what I'd like people to understand, is the principles don't change. The biomechanics, they're laws. This is what happens. That's the math. But every athlete is unique. Every athlete changes physically and mentally. And sometimes you want to do things biomechanically that work, but the athlete, you can tell, is not 100% buying into it, or isn't getting that feeling is too weird yet. So if you're trying to, specifically load a leg and they don't quite feel where their center of mass is, they're not ready to change there. But we constantly need to assess and reassess, and everything comes back down to the simple principles. And again, stability is always going to be the biggest one, and really nailing that center of gravity and looking at it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carolyn. So we're going to wrap it there today. I'm going to stop the recording right away. I'd like to thank everyone who's been in attendance today. Again, questions, I've put my email in the chat for anyone who wants to send us questions for clarification or continuity. We will have other biomechanic lunch and learns. Please type your NCCP number as you're checking out in the chat. This way I will be able to attribute NCCP PD point if you wish it. So thanks a lot to everyone. Hopefully see you the next one. Next Lunch and Learn, by the way, will be on program planning, and that will be with Jess Kriski coming up soon. We will be posting that in a newsletter. Thanks to all. Recording is done. We will post the PowerPoint and the video for future viewing. So see you all at the next one. I'm just going to stop recording.